In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row that mark our place.
Good morning. Very happy to be in Guelph this morning, standing in front of the National Historic Site of Canada. It's the McCrae House, named after John McCrae, doctor, soldier, poet, as he was the author of In Flanders Fields, a poem that is going to be read thousands of times on this Remembrance Day. So excited to be here to explore it, and happy to be joined by Ken Irvin from the city of Guelph. Good morning, Ken.
Good morning, glad to have you here.
Awesome. This is where he was born.
John was born right in this house in 1872, November 30th, 1872. And it was the starter house for his mom and dad. His parents moved in here when they got married. They had their firstborn. John's older brother Thomas was born here. Then John was born here. And then a couple years later, they moved out. It was a starter house. And they moved closer to the downtown where their family business was.
Who is John McCrae, for anybody that doesn't know? They probably know the poem, but if they don't know John.
John, it's hard to put in one sentence because he did so much. He's an incredible doctor. He was a noted poet, and he was like to be known as a soldier. He was really involved in the military, from being a cadet when he was 14 all the way up to serving in the First World War. When he was 41 when he joined up, and 45 when he passed away.
If John was here today and we asked him that question, would he want to be referred to as a doctor, as a soldier, or as a poet? Would you have any idea what he would say?
I think the amount of work he put into his medical career, I think he'd want to be known as a doctor. He was a top-notch physician. He's been inducted in the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame, so he was a great physician. And you know, poetry and writing was a sideline. It was a hobby of his, just like writing, drawing was. The military was a passion, but he was a great doctor.
When did it become a National Historic Site?
1967 was when it first became a National Historic Site, and people actually were afraid this house was going to be torn down and turned into apartment buildings. So they started the John McCrae Birthplace Society and fundraised, and some people actually had to mortgage their homes to try and preserve this, to save it from the wrecking ball.
Because you not only have the house, but you have the memorial right next door.
Yes, right, and the memorial was there before this was a National Historic Site. So people were still living in this house while the memorial was in their side garden.
And I'm assuming a day like today, that memorial site is very popular. Maybe not this year, but any other year?
On a normal year, this place would be packed, with John McCrae Public School doing their service here. The Legion has a service that they do in the morning, and then people just drop by all day because this is a place that they want to be to
Anybody can come by?
Anyone.
Because it is open year round?
We're open, free to the public on Remembrance Day.
Excellent.
Every year.
Okay. Can we hang out for the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we want to hang out for the morning because we want to go inside. We want to show the house a little bit. Let's learn about John the soldier. Let's learn about how he wrote the poem In Flanders Fields, and let's learn about the association between In Flanders Fields and the poppy that we wear on this Remembrance Day, lest we forget.
In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row that mark our place.
Good morning. Welcome back to McCrae House in Guelph. As we're learning more about John McCrae, the man who, we read his poem each and every Remembrance Day, and it will be read thousands of times today. Happy to be joined by Ken Irvin from the city of Guelph, who's giving us a tour.
Yeah.
Inside the home. And so we know the poem, and we'll get to the poem in a little bit, but who was John McCrae the soldier?
John was someone who was involved in the military from a very early age. He started when he was 14, and his dad actually set up the 1882 Wellington Rifle Cadet Corps in Guelph. So he was really influenced by his dad. And his dad was also involved in the Fenian raids early on before that. So his dad was really a big impression on him. And then he stayed with the cadets. He went to Kingston. He received a gold medal for being the best trained cadet in all of Ontario. And he stayed with the militia throughout his life. When he was at the University of Toronto and on, he was with the cadets. And then when the Boer War started, he wanted to go immediately, and he missed the first contingent and was really upset. And then When Canada sent a second contingent to South Africa, John joined up and went as an artilleryman, not as a medical man. And that was really important for him. He wanted to be where the fighting was, where the action was.
Was he one of those guys that just did everything well?
Yes, yeah, and he was a really great writer. He was a brilliant medical man, top in his class at the University of Toronto, first student from Guelph to receive a full scholarship to the University of Toronto. He was a really good artist. He was, just everything he did was, he touched was golden pretty well.
Why did he want to go to World War I? Because he was older.
He was 41 when the war started, and he had a feeling that this was going to be a horrible conflict. And in a letter he wrote to his mother, he said that this is going to be a terrible war. And he goes, I'm really afraid of this war, but I'm more afraid not to go. And he just knew it was something he had to do.
Something very special that you have here are his medals.
Yes. Those are something we acquired almost 20 years ago, and they have a really interesting story and a bit of a history on their own, because we didn't have them for a while. They seemed to have disappeared. We had a pair of replacement medals because we didn't think his originals existed, and then all of a sudden they came up at auction. And we were really lucky to have a gentleman named Arthur Lee purchase them at auction for $400,000 and then donate them to the McCrae House Museum.
When did John die?
John died in the war in January 28, 1918, in the last year of the war, and he died from pneumonia and meningitis, and that was the official diagnosis. Could have been Spanish influenza, but his diagnosis at the time was that.
He wrote In Flanders Fields.
In one of the first years of the war, the first time the Canadians were involved in a major battle was in the Second Battle of Ypres, where the poison gas was first used, and that was in May in 1915.
1915. We'll stop there because we want to tell the story about how John McCrae that is, wrote In Flanders Fields on this Remembrance Day, lest we forget. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row. Just the first two lines of the most famous war poem that was ever penned. And I'm honored to be at the birthplace of the man who penned that, McCrae House. John McCrae here in Guelph, Ontario, with Ken from the city of Guelph giving us a tour this morning. So let's get into the poem, and when and why he wrote the poem. Ken. Well,
it was really a poem that was written in the heat of battle. It was written during the Second Battle of Ypres, and John was kind of not so inspired, but he had a friend that was killed. A young man named Lieutenant Alexis Helmer had a shell land literally right on top of him, blew him to bits. They gathered up what they could find of this young man who was 22 years old, put the pieces they found in the shape of a body and buried them that night. And John actually said the service over his friend's grave that night. And he was really upset. Like, he'd seen the carnage and the death during the Second Battle of Ypres, and he sat down the next day during a break in surgeries and on the back of an ambulance and wrote out this poem.
In some of the research, I want to pop in here because there's so many great artifacts and kind of goes to where the poem was first published. There's a lot of stories of where or how long it took for him to write it.
Yeah.
Some people think it was just 10 to 15 minutes. You think it might be a little bit different?
It could have been 10 or 15 minutes. Like, it's something that when he wrote it, he was sitting there on the ambulance and he would have looked up and seen poppies growing. He would have seen crosses because he was at a small hospital, and there would have been a cemetery there where the soldiers who did not survive were buried. So in freshly turned over ground, poppies love to grow. And so poppies would have been growing between the crosses. So he wrote about things he literally saw right in front of him.
Okay, so this is the first published...
This is in Punch magazine where it first was published.
Okay, and is Punch, it's more of a satirical...
It's a satirical British magazine. John actually sent the poem to the London Times and they rejected it. And so he sent it on to Punch magazine and it was published.
How did it take off? How did it become so big?
It became an anthem. Like, after you read it, you said, this is so good. Have you read it? And they passed it on to a friend. Have you read this poem? Or have you heard John McCrae's poem? And it just became such an anthem that it was just passed from hand to hand and mouth to mouth. And it just took on a life of its own. Did
he know how popular it became?
Did, because the poem was written in 1915, and John didn't pass away until 1918. January 19.
And even if we look behind us here on the wall, it was used to buy victory
in
bonds.
victory bond drives. So part of the poems were used because people knew of the poem and they were so moved by it. Even not just in Canada or England, but in the United States and France and Belgium. People all knew of this poem and they took it on as an anthem to themselves. The Americans wrote responses to it, so it became huge.
Okay, well, we have to go, but there's so many artifacts that are from the First World War
Yes.
on this table, and McCrae House. Anybody can come here and visit, right?
Absolutely.
So we'll leave on that, but when we come back, let's bring the connection. I know you touched on it. The connection between In Flanders Fields and the poppy that we're all wearing today on this Remembrance Day, lest we forget.
In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row that mark our place.
On this Remembrance Day, we think of all of those who have fought for our freedoms in world wars in the past and continue to fight today. And we wear this poppy to honor those that have fought for their lives. And it's great to be here in Guelph. Spent the morning at the McCrae House right next door here, and this is a memorial dedicated to John McCrae, author of In Flanders Fields, and with Ken from the city of Guelph. It's been fascinating to learn more about John, and you probably see that with people coming through, because they know the poem so well, but they don't know the man who wrote it.
That's exactly it. They want to find out more about this man who wrote the poem. They know it, but they need to understand his reasons for writing it and what inspired him.
Connection to the poppy.
Now the poppy, when John wrote the poem, he saw poppies in front of him when he wrote the poem. They were growing between the crosses and the graves beside his hospital. And so after he wrote the poem and the poem became popular, people used the poem, the poppy, as an anthem. And there was a French woman who, after the war, made paper poppies and sold them to raise money for orphans. And then a woman from Atlanta, Georgia, took it up when the Americans started into the war. And she started selling poppies to raise money for the Veterans Associations. And then she approached the British and the Canadian Great War Veterans Associations and to take up the poppy as a symbol of the war. And they wanted to have French civilians make the poppies, but eventually the Canadian veterans made poppies.
Because we don't know, poppies aren't really, they're not native to us.
They're not. They're not.
You could compare them to what here?
A dandelion here. They're just a wildflower in France.
So when you're turning soil over, you would see poppies being grown?
They reseed themselves throughout the season. So when you're turning over the soil, poppy seeds are just spreading themselves and growing again and again.
It's a worldwide poem, but obviously here in Canada, because John is Canadian. In England, in Britain?
In England, at the Tower of London, they had the thousands of ceramic poppies that they laid in the moat of. They used the poppy. The British wear the poppy. The Australians, the British Commonwealth mainly wears the poppy. The Americans still, in some cases, wear it, but not as often.
Is there one thing that you really like to tell everybody about John, or about the poem, that they might not know?
It's a poem that was written in the heart of a war, in the heat of battle, and it's something that inspired thousands of people to take up the cause. And I still have problems reading the poem out loud without getting choked up.
Yeah, especially on a day like today.
Yeah.
Thanks so much
for
the tour.
Yeah.
McCrae House is open all year.
You're right.
You can.
We're closed in the winter months, but throughout the summer.
Okay, so just in the summer then.
Yeah.
Okay, so just in the summer you
and
can come
right
and
up till November.
Into November. All right. Well, thanks for the tour on this Remembrance Day, lest we forget.